Hello student, welcome to this special session of discussion on the state, civil society and globalization. This discussion relates to our MA program in Sociology, specifically Sociology of Development, Block 6 and 8. To have this discussion in the studio, we are having among us Professor Peter J. Smith. He is a professor of political science, Athabasca University, the Open University of Canada. Professor Peter J. Smith has extensively written in the areas of globalization and its interface with the state. Professor Peter, as you know, recently we were talking about the role of a state in the globalized world in the context of introduction of the structural adjustment program and also in the context of redefining the role of the state as propagated by the World Bank. How do you like to visualize the role of the state in this changing context?
Well, I think to understand the role of the state in the contemporary context, one must go back and look at the original purposes and functions of the state as they were articulated in 18th and 19th century Europe and have spread throughout the world. The state is a social formation, an institutional formation that has been socially constructed and socially defined within a European context, but has now become the dominant territorial organization of power throughout the globe. So we have to go back and look at the state from the very beginning. And originally the state really had two fundamental purposes. One, it had to protect its citizens from disruptions and violence from within and threats from without. So it had to promote public safety. That is still fundamental today, as you know, in a world of terror, protecting one's citizens. The second critical function was the protection of property. Property in various dimensions, property of the person, but primarily property in regard to the functioning of a capitalist system. These were two fundamental functions. Now, in the 19th century and the 20th century, we had a changing function of the state. The state was primarily, until the 19th century, would describe as a liberal state. That is, in terms of having laws that would protect capital. But in the 19th century, those who were excluded from power demanded to participate in the state. So the state took on a more democratic function, permitting participation and the growth of democratic institutions, the spread of the franchise to more and more people, not just those with property. In the 20th century, we had a series of economic crises and depressions, and the state was seen as having to have a fundamental role in a variety of welfare areas. We call the growth of the welfare state, as the students may be well aware of. We have the growing role of the state in terms of providing public education, the growing role of the state in providing elements such as unemployment insurance are a safety net for those who had been harmed or had become unemployed. And the state also had a fundamental role in terms of the promotion of public health. So we really had three really changing dimensions of citizenship in regard to the state. And one, first of all, we had a liberal state, the protection of property, a system of courts, laws to ensure they're protected, a more democratic state that permitted participation and self-rule. And finally, we had what we might call a state in terms of social citizenship to ensure that people at least had a minimal form of livelihood so they could have put a real meaning to democratic citizenship. Now, what has happened, started to happen in the late 20th century, is that the capitalist system began to enter a series of crises that then had impact on the state. The state, for most of this period, was fundamental in terms of citizenship and identity. It was a fundamental focus of politics and political activity, economic activity, and much of social activity. So we had a state-centric social, economic, and political system. In the late 20th century, in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a falling rate of profit for many capitalist firms and corporations. So they were making less. Their profits over time were falling. The state was also beginning to enter a period of crisis. The state was taking on more and more debt. The deficits were becoming larger and larger. There was more and more money being borrowed. Yeah. And the state was unable to cope. And there was growing criticism of its ability to deliver services to the public in a way that was intended. So the state was vulnerable to challenge. And in the late 20th century, particularly the 1990s, the state was challenged fundamentally in terms of its role within society. And in particular, corporations wanted to expand outside the boundaries and borders of the state, to increase their market access, to increase their profitability. And they demanded that the state facilitate that. And they did it really in two ways. One, they wanted a set of rules so that when they operated outside the state, to ensure that their property and profits were protected. They wanted the same rules applied externally as were applied internally. So there's a change here. And the state was also was under siege or under attack because of its high deficits. And corporate capital demanded the state reduce its deficits, reduce its spending, to have cutbacks. So we had the fundamental functions of the state that we articulated earlier being challenged. The welfare state was being challenged in terms of the state providing services. There was a demand in this country in terms of structural adjustment. Okay, the government had to cut back. They had to permit capital to come in. They had to liberalize, and foreign capital had to be put on the same footing as many Indian institutions, organizations, and corporations. So there was a challenge at a variety of levels in terms of economics and politics. So what you had, in essence, was a growing capacity of the economic sector, of corporations to function outside the state. And you had a gradual, what was often described as a hollowing out of the state, as many of the functions of the state began to be privatized. Yeah.
So, in this context, what is very important is that as the state is not the sole agency now,
right.
Because whatsoever the function you pointed about the state,
right.
In the process of evolution, many of the role of the state is taken care of by the market now, the corporate world, the multinational agencies. In between that, there has also emerged the civil societies in the functioning of the state. So how do you place the role of civil society in taking away some of the role of the state, both providing security in the economic terms and in social terms?
Exactly. This is a logical extension of our foregoing comments. What we have now is a change, a description of the change is as follows. We have a change from government to governance. Okay? Government really refers to the institutional capacity of the state to govern its territory. It was a primary agency to deliver services and interact with society at large. With governance, we have a change in this regard. Governance comes from the Greek word meaning to steer a society. Yeah. And no longer do we conceive of the state as being the primary agency or set of institutions that steers the society. This responsibility is being divided out. It's being parceled out to multinational corporations, and to agencies in civil society. So in essence, what we have is a fragmentation of the sovereign power of the state. On the one hand, we have it going up to the level of more global institutions, such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. We have more power flowing down below to local levels, to equivalent of your states or provinces, and down to urban areas and down to local levels. We also have it flowing out into civil society at large. Civil society defined quite broadly. I define the economy as a sphere of civil society, but also civil society in the terms of an area where we have non-governmental organizations operating. And many of these non-governmental organizations are now taking on the role of the state in delivering services. The state, many locations throughout the world, this is a general problem, the state was seen as being ineffectual, as lacking capacity, and as being seen as corrupt. Okay, so many, in many cases, in the issue of development, many donor agencies were refusing to put money through the hands of the state because most of the money was being siphoned off through corrupt officials, okay? And that money was being lost. So there was a preference, okay, for many donor agencies. There was a preference from agencies such as the World Bank, okay, to de-emphasize the role of the state in terms of delivery of public services. That's one facet of non-governmental organizations, non-profit organizations, of delivering services. Of course, as we move through the discussion, we'll discover that there's another role of non-governmental organizations, and that is to function as advocacy of civil society, act as advocates of the people, as the state has started to shrink, has started to shrivel, and has become hollowed out, and it's really stopped, in many cases, stopped listening to the population at large, that somebody has to articulate the concerns of the people. And there are non-governmental organizations who take on this role. But most non-governmental organizations have some role of service, and they take on some role of advocacy. So it's a continuum from greater emphasis on service to greater emphasis on advocacy. And many of these, what I describe as service non-government organizations, are little more than extensions of the state. So we have to be careful of looking at them as being fully independent of the state, as functioning with an autonomous civil society, because they're funded in many cases by the state. They're funded by other states, okay? And they're funded by other institutions of governance. So they lack autonomy. So we have to be very careful in terms of how we're defining non-governmental organizations or looking at them. But what we have is really a fragmentation in terms of power in society, and more we have power flowing away from the state, flowing into the hands of corporations, of other civil society organizations, and outside the state to institutions of governance.
Specifically now, with regard to the civil society and defining the NGOs, as you correctly pointed out, but the contradiction remains. At times they are being explained as a pro-state. Right. At times they have been explained as a pro-market. But are they really pro-people? I mean, putting those two things together, civil society has emerged as a catalyst to serve the need of the people at the grassroots. Now, what's your experience says in terms of performing the role at the grassroots by the civil societies, especially in the developing world?
Well, again, we have to be very careful how we define civil society, because there's a tendency when you define civil society to only look at groups that we like, okay? And these are people that work for the people, supposedly, are advocacy groups. But there are also civil society organizations, okay, what we describe in our country as chambers of commerce. They're business associations. They're non-governmental organizations. They speak for business, okay? Business associations have their own, okay, non-governmental organizations. So non-governmental organizations only means that it's non-government. It doesn't necessarily mean it's working for the people or working for, in terms of advocacy. Okay? And many, as noted earlier, many non-governmental organizations are simply there as extensions of the state. Now, in terms of development and the grassroots, there's a growing preference in many instances for greater decentralization of the state, decentralization in terms of power, and linking the grassroots to the larger civil society. And in this regard, communications technologies are playing a more important role in that regard. It's often been said that the local are the front lines of globalization. So they're being heavily impacted by globalization. But in terms of the issues of development, the state, in terms of its concept of development, promoting the social welfare of the people, this has been severely eroded. Okay? So it's become more and more the responsibility of civil society organizations to link with the people, to link with the grassroots, and ensure those interests are articulated at a variety of levels in society. At a state level, in terms of the Indian state or our provinces, at the national level, and the global level. Let's take the example of what's happening to farmers and the control over seeds. Multinational corporations are demanding the right to have patent over a variety of life forms, including seeds, and even the neem tree in this country was originally patented, and it had to be contested. You had to act for the grassroots, but this occurred through the courts. This occurred really through the activity of many civil society organizations who had extensive contacts at the grassroots level and were able to articulate the concerns. But let's go back to what's happening in terms of the farmer. Farmers are losing increasingly their control over what they plant, as being a producer of seeds, for example, to a consumer of seeds. And these seeds are being now produced, controlled by a handful of companies, maybe 8 in the world. A large one, for example, is Monsanto. And so the farmer is increasingly having to go to corporations, multinational corporations, who are having property control over the essence of life, not only in this country, but other countries. And we see this in terms of other aspects of food production. So it's impacting on the local level directly. It's causing in many areas a crisis in terms of farmers. The suicide rate of farmers throughout the world is increasing as they're being dislocated by the impacting forces of globalization. So the local level is, again, the front lines of the global, and there's a direct intersection, a direct collision, and many non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations are trying to act as the voice of the people to ensure that the larger society, the country as a whole, has some understanding of what's happening. But the problem really won't be solved necessarily, even at the level of the Indian national government or our Canadian national government, because power has been divided up. You have to go and function at a global level as well. So what we have really in terms of the function of politics and society, that is becoming increasingly complex, increasingly fragmented. You have to have the ability to work at a variety of levels. You can't not just concentrate only on the grassroots per se, because the grassroots is exposed to a very turbulent world today.
It is very nicely told that nothing can be explained in terms of the grassroots formation. It's very important. I want to draw your kind attention towards the World Development Summit Resolution 1995, Copenhagen. Though the civil societies are functioning in the developing part of the world, 16th, 17th century onward, but it got a momentum proliferation after this process of structural adjustment program and World Development Summit 1995. It's categorically mentioned the civil society initiative are to be encouraged, number one. Number two, these are to be integrated with the initiative taken by the state. And the state should provide all the legal, constitutional, and legislative framework for the functioning and enlarge the activities of the civil societies. Now, what does it mean? Does it mean the state in the developing part of the world has entered into an arena of credibility crisis? Because of this credibility crisis, the civil societies are emerging, or there is exactly a need or demand of the civil society activism at the grassroots, so they are responding to that need. And how do you like to visualize this contradictory situation?
This is a very important question, and I think it has to be visualized really in a global context. You mentioned the crisis of credibility. I would describe it as a crisis of legitimacy throughout the world. All our fundamental institutions, whether it be the state, the media, the private sector in terms of corporations, are in a state of crisis in terms of how they are being approved of, are accepted by the population of the world at large. So it's a legitimacy crisis. Okay? Now it's ironic in terms of this legitimacy crisis that the set of organizations that have the greatest approval of the people of the world are non-governmental organizations. Non-governmental, not just in one country, but throughout the world. And this is very interesting in the sense that increasingly non-government organizations are being seen as the embodiment of the public interest. But I want to go back in terms of your question in terms of the assistance that the civil society should take on more responsibilities, but they should work within a framework as articulated by the state. I see this really as an attempt by the state to discipline and control civil society, to make sure it functions within bounds and is supportive of the larger global project of neoliberalism, the spreading of market ideas, and to keep this element of society under its thumb, under its purview, under control. But this is not really being accepted. There are really two forms of globalization that have been articulated. One from above, with the sense of globalization above in terms of corporate power interacting with state to set rules to allow neoliberalization, the spread of privatization, and the spread of markets. And the job of the state, in essence, is to go back to one of the original functions of the state, is to protect property, to have rules for property, and ensure there's no social disruption. So in essence, the role of the state is shriveling back to these two elements. And as you articulated, Deepal, the state is trying to ensure that as civil society organizations do not go out of control, that they're disciplined and that they stay in their place. On the other hand, we have globalization from below, that people are increasingly able to challenge the role of the state, to contest it. And no longer do we have politics being confined to the state. We have the capacity of organizations to network, to spread beyond the state, to challenge corporate globalization at all levels. So we have really a contested element of politics. So no matter what the state says it wants, it's not being accepted by many people in society. And I would say, in effect, that the overwhelming majority of the people of the world do not accept this system of neoliberal globalization or liberalization as we describe it. There's data. And the best source for data, and I can just offer it to the students, is the World Economic Forum, that tribunal where you have all the hoi polloi, all the elite of the world meet in Davos, Switzerland. They've conducted these surveys, and I'm basing my interpretation of data on legitimacy as extrapolating from the surveys. All they have to do is student go to this website they can access to computer, go to the World Economic Forum and type in survey or poll, and look at these polls over the last 2 years. And then what they measure is the people of the world feel that, in fact, that they're worse off than they were 10 years ago. And they're losing confidence in their own institutions. So even the economic elite of the world recognize that we're now in a period of crisis, of acceptance, of credibility, and legitimacy. And this is, I think, the fundamental rock on which this whole ship will crash.
Well, thank you for giving this kind of a lucid explanation. Now the problem remains at another end. There has also been a process of co-opting the civil society within the state fold. Now, civil society in the developing part of the world has emerged as a social force, as a social movement. They are contesting the authorities of domination. Millions of people are finding a hope within the civil society activism. Now, if this space is used in the name of state intervention, only to co-opt the civil society within the state, how to find the future of civil society in this third world context?
Well, the state is attempting to control, the state is attempting to co-opt, and so are multinational corporations. I mean, this is always present. One needs funding, one needs money. Someone has to donate and provide funds, revenues, so you can function as a civil society organization, as a non-governmental organization. And because the state is a provider of funds in many instances, it can set parameters, it can set restrictions upon how this money is spent. So this becomes an instrument of social control for many non-government organizations. But there are many non-government organizations who function outside of funds being received from the state per se. They raise it through their own money-raising efforts. They get money from outside from a variety of organizations. Okay? And so they do have some funds of which, and they're often very marginal organizations, but they're there. They're providing a very vital role. And if you meet people in these civil society organizations, non-government organizations, you'll see that they're very public-spirited, very public-interested, And they are aware of the elements of co-optation, and they're careful to watch out for them. So there is a degree of autonomy. So we have to be very careful in terms of the state is able to control all of civil society. It's able to control a certain degree of civil society. But India is still a free society. There's still freedom of association. There's still freedom to criticize. Governments and corporations don't provide all funding. So there is a degree of autonomy. And in an age of networking, an age of information and communication technologies, it means that these marginalized groups are more and more find it easier to collaborate and work together to challenge what's going on. They're able to pool their resources. This is a great strength in many ways of our new technologies, as they permit the networking form of organization to flourish, not only in terms of networking corporations, networking states, such as working through the WTO, but networking civil society organizations who don't have many resources, but are able to work together to collaborate, to share brain power, to articulate their own message. So there is not a complete takeover by the state of civil societies, because civil society in its true robust form means that there's a sphere of autonomy of the state. If you're not autonomous of the state, you're really an extension of the state. And in many cases, this is what has happened to many non-government organizations. They simply become an extension of the state. But I'm talking about a sphere that has retained a degree of autonomy from the state and are able to articulate the concerns of those at the grassroots and at higher levels of society.
Now, very briefly, I want your reflection on this. Now that we are in an era, we can't deny the process of globalization. We can't deny the process of functioning of the state. Right. And also, we can't deny the process of emergence of the civil society and the market forces. Right. What should be the ideal local of civil society within this gamut of functioning of the state, market, and the process of structural adjustment program?
The ideal function and role of civil society? I think the role of primary function of civil society is to encourage a democratic spirit within society and to bring out into society that which was hidden, to give voice to the voiceless, to make the invisible visible, so the state and corporations cannot hide from their responsibilities. If problems and issues are unknown, then society, and through its institutions of the state, doesn't have to address them. So I think there's a primary role of civil society to make sure that the needs of those who have been disempowered are re-empowered through their activities and articulated and are no longer invisible.
Thank you, Professor Smith, for sharing your valuable experience in a very lucid manner. I believe our student community will be largely benefited with your talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for being here, Debo.